All right. Welcome back to another Getting Back to Work, week 3. We'll get started here in a minute or so. It started a little bit early just to get rolling, but appreciate everyone who's on. Appreciate everybody that keeps coming week by week. So this is pretty fun, having a good time with this. So we'll get started in a couple minutes. As you can see, still at my parents' place. For those of you that were here last week, I live outside Washington, D.C. We came down to Florida for a little bit to spend some time with the family. So soon we'll have the normal backdrop other than my parents' room in here. But all right, so why don't we go ahead? We'll kick it off. So week 3, like I said, this is Leo Desk with Group 337, Inside Access Control, Inside Visitor Management, the Inside. We're building the brands around being a platform in the business of information. So this is one of the things that we do. We do a weekly Getting Back to Work live on YouTube. It's really a conversation that we try to have around articles that we found interesting that week that we think relate to the access control industry, as well as those that work with the access control industry. And we'd like to talk about it. We do this in partnership with our friends at Openpath. They were wonderful to help sponsor this, to help us bring this together. But we do this in conjunction with a newsletter that goes out tomorrow, which will have these articles as well as a little bit of an overview of thoughts and impressions that we have from those articles, as well as some more information from Openpath. So we've got 3 pretty cool articles, I believe. One of them is a follow-up, a part 2 of one that we talked about in the first week. We've got another one from, I'm looking at my notes here, the Harvard Business Review, which is probably one of the best things I've read in a long, long time. We'll get into it. And then the last one being something I saw actually on CBS News this weekend on Sunday morning. If for those of you that watch that, it was with Cushman Wakefield and talk about this, the Office of the Future. So pretty cool stuff. The other thing was, if we're talking about articles, Openpath recently, I'm always a big fan when I see news, especially in the mainstream that we talk about. And coming off the raise, the USA Today had an article about how really COVID is making the access control industry explode, which we've been talking about. And they're an example of that. Great article, really gets into why, what's driving it, and then a good history of the company itself. So highly recommend you taking a look at that. So if we look at the first article that we had, it was called How Coronavirus Has Changed the Office as We Know It, part 2. Comes from our friend at KaraLynn Lewis. She handles partnerships for a company called Office App based out of the Netherlands. The article was in Unnissu, which is a great resource for those of you in the prop tech side. Meet a lot of people, see a lot of good content there. But if you look at what KaraLynn was talking about now, so the first one was really about the impacts of what coronavirus is doing. This one now gets into really what you should do in a lot of ways, and some ways that could help you get there, to where the idea of like the spaces being these coordinated, critical places that drive comfort as well as safety and health, and just all these new requirements that we have. They also, she got into the concepts and the idea about lack of social spaces and interaction, and really it was about culture and collaboration and people wanting to be with community and be together. There were some tools that I thought were great. That sort of 3, if you would, is 4. I'm sorry. That tools to help drive some of the collaboration, the community, help with health and wellness, and that you should take a look at in technology. Things like data insight. This can help you manage the data itself. And I think that's the important part now that we're starting to see a lot of systems are starting to talk about data, which is great. You can get data off of it, but what you do with the data is equally important. So having the ability to manage it, get valuable insights, and then really have learnings, because I think that's going to be the next step of this. And we start to see people communicate and talk about, and things that the access control systems that need to do. And if you're on the buying side, things that I would recommend that you start asking about is the idea of sort of like, what does the data do? What's the impacts it can have? I think it's also fair to say what bad could happen with it, but it's about what that data does, not just that you have it. It's like one thing if it says, hey, the occupancy is 22 people and it should only be 20, but then what? So really asking those questions. But data insights is one of them. The idea of introducing dynamic and bookable systems, which again had some play before. You saw companies doing that, but I would say that was more around nice to have stuff. Now, this dynamic and bookable systems are actually being driven by necessity in a lot of spaces, not only for the demand capabilities, if you would, of making sure the places are clean. You know, maybe it locks it now, where before it was about opening it. Now it locks it to make sure that the cleaning service was done. But even more is this idea that you can take your spaces and actually have a new revenue opportunity that goes through. So let's say you have a conference room that isn't being used or offices that aren't being used. You can now have that ability to bring those out to the community and make them usable by people that need that space. The other side of it being just making it dynamic within a building. So if you happen to be in a high rise or mid rise, whatever it might be, you have some empty spaces. Instead of every floor having a conference room, you now can share those. So utilizing tools to be able to do that. There's a lot of them that are out there in the space to do that nowadays. The other places that you talked about too were like locker storage, which is interesting as well. So making that dynamic as well. Because now if you have people coming and going, they may need to lock stuff inside of a space. So really thinking through the use cases that I think it's one thing just to have a conference room that, you know, you open it up to being booking, but thinking around the edges of how do you make that experience better? Like, for instance, the lockable lockers, which I thought was a great idea. Connecting the community. So you hear this a lot in the tenant experience side, but even broadening that out even more, the community could be beyond just the building itself. You know, you look at things like Nextdoor, some applications like that of how you bring the commercial structures into the consumer residential, and how you bridge those and have conversations, but connecting that community, not only in the space, but broadening out. The integrating technology and experience. So she talks about in this one, whether it's like Wi-Fi keys, the ability to get amenities like things being ordered, on-demand services, especially if you're utilizing third-party spaces that you're not used to, that ability to quickly be able to capture those, that will help drive a better sense of community. It'll drive a better sense of pleasure, if you would, for the people that are using the space, as well as I think it also heightens your view of them of just being of service, which I think is important. The last part inside this report was that they did actually an industry report. It was called the Happy Office Life Report, and that they found that the main driver of value for offices was the ability to control their own environment, which I thought was interesting. And that's the other part of these applications that if you think, especially in the access control side, historically our applications in the access control end was the ability to use it like a key. And that was on the end user side. If I'm an admin, it was about managing that. But now it's this idea about the user itself also being able to control the environment. So how you integrate other things into it, the ability to give access or request access and control that. Maybe it's bringing in, so if you work remotely, like tying it into G Suite and things like that, that bring your information with you so that you could tie, you know, your documents and the rest. So it's this idea of controlling the environment and those applications that you use for the space are being driven by this idea that people are going to go back. It may not be at the speed of which we believe, but everything that you're reading and now people are talking about, there is this desire and need for a sense of community, a sense of collaboration. Even people that, like myself, have been working remote, it was always nice to have that ability to go in someplace. I don't care if it was the coffee shop, a co-working space, whatever it might be, but even those spaces are becoming limited. So really being able to create that sense of community, highly important. And then the control side once you're there, which leads me to the next article, which I thought was fantastic. I'm going to put it out so you can read it if you haven't yet. It's called In Praise of the Office. It was a Harvard Business Review by GIANPIERO. I don't want to butcher his name, I apologize. But GIANPIERO studies this. He looks at the offices and the relationship that people have with spaces. Super, super interesting. So the guy that studies it, he was a guy that forever was not in an office and didn't have a job. He worked up on himself. Then he went and got a job and had an office and really got deep into what this space means. And you're hearing it a bit, and I'll get into the terms that they're used, but spaces and offices have historically been an identity workspace, which I thought was interesting. It was a representation of the person. It was a space where we could learn what it means and what it takes to be someone that's in there. So they were saying, like, take a soldier, a chef, a lawyer, a doctor, a leader, and then through a bundle of stories, practices, feedback, rituals, everything. It's about this idea about remaining and having a connection with the space, and that office was an extension of you as you went there. It changes a bit when it's your house at the same time. And the problem, though, is that you had when we didn't have as much working from home and you had people working at the office, there was this great desire to figure out how to keep yourself in this preservation of yourself while you're at the office. And now it's totally flipped, right? You don't have that for a lot of people, but there's this desire to have that. It says in here that professionals themselves that are at home, we need and love to hate at times the office. But in the end, his belief, as someone who studies this, there's going to be this great desire for people to have that. There was a quote in here, which I thought was great, is that technology has already collapsed the boundaries between the work and the home. The office, at least, was a solid membrane between the two. And it may possibly be the last sort of separation between you as the person yourself and your office, right? Now it's at home, and I even feel it myself, where the separation part is very hard. There is a sense of having to do it to be purposeful to do that, but even so, if we're all being honest, at least for me, if I'm being honest, using my I words instead of you in that, as I was told by a corporate psychologist a while ago, but if I use the I words on myself, it's this idea of like how to find the space, and yeah, as Mandy says in here, to reestablish yourself and how to create that point of separation, which I think is hard if we're being fair and honest with ourselves. So we're like a quarter in to the COVID crisis, right? The pandemic, everyone being home. I don't know about you, but it's like, you know, if you look at like the movie The Matrix, when they were shooting bullets at him and he was sort of like slow motion them going by, for me, it's been total chaos on that end of trying to like manage the whole thing. I've got 2 kids working from home, all of that stuff, right? Some people, a lot of people have it a lot worse than I do. So there's just a lot of pressures, right? But now with the idea of like being purposeful and trying to create those difference. He also talks about the point of the office that being is not to make people more productive. It was about bringing them together, which I thought was interesting. Because I've and having a lot of conversations and reading a lot, there is this conversation where people are busy, but we're not sure if we're more productive. And the purpose of the office was to increase that level of productivity. And some people felt it, some people you didn't, because you had things like, you know, people interrupting you, maybe things move. Like I made a while ago was one of the companies I worked for, we developed an open office architecture, and that became very distracting for people. But the purpose was for productivity. And it was also about bringing people together in the collaborative team approach that people want, still need that. The story goes on to say that for the office as an independent worker, for some that wanted that, they looked at the office as like a prison. It was like it wouldn't allow them the opportunity to be themselves in that side, right? They felt, so they flipped to being on the outside, but everything is like on top of itself now, right? So it was a prison for the soul, they called it, where managers were arbitrary, policies were unreasonable, and constraints. And yet those same people thought of it as cozy in a way, because again, they had a place to go to, which I think was needed. It went on to talk about the most successful among those lone workers, so people that were working outside of the office. They've invest heavily in cultivating kinds of connections that most offices provided as a bundle, which I thought was interesting, right? So this idea that the office provided these bundles, right, of connection and people that maybe you didn't think about because they were just intrinsically there. But now that we're separated from it, you're looking for it. And I don't know about you, there is a level of community that you do see online, but it's different than when you're in the office and there's other humans there that you can collaborate and create. So I thought it was pretty interesting that they had this idea where there's this purposeful connections in a place that they had to go find that now, and it's as a standard practice and really creating this larger purpose. So what's interesting, they talked about this. Go back to the productivity side. That right now there's a lot of cases where people are feeling, you know, productive but busy, but it's being driven by anxiety, which I thought was interesting. And it really talks about how people and managers are going to actually have to start to understand that. and that you really are running a risk that if people are worried about like losing their jobs, is it in my own hands now? Is it a good career? Don't know. There's all this anxiety that gets created out of the way that we're working right now. To be cognizant of that, not just necessarily celebrate the productivity that you may be feeling, but really dig a little bit deeper into it to really understand what's driving some of that. It goes back to this term that we talked about last week, which was the I can never say this, the presenteeism. So this idea that you have to present yourself. So like when you went to the office, and in this idea that you have to show up to every single meeting, and this idea that if you have a Zoom link that drops on your calendar, that you have to be present and show it. Like, so it's this struggle that people are having with that. So in the end on this one, it says, many more people will reach us through our screens, but will they see us? Super deep, I know, but still very interesting. This idea that you have this case of remoteness, but will it harmonize the people like we believe it will? Or, as they say in here, will it make it more mechanical? I think it's just super interesting to think about. And I'll leave you with this that says, all I know is that we may miss the office and the managers too, when we're all working for algorithms from home or on the road, dependent on our screens and at the constant mercy of the market. Very interesting. Highly recommend that you read it. A little controversial in the way that they think about it, but if you to take it a little bit deeper to think about what does it mean from the access control stand, I do think these pressures impact the way that we market, position, sell, build, and look at the use cases of how our systems are going to work. So highly recommend that you take a look at it, do some critical thinking, maybe bring it into your next happy hour group talk where you think about things. It's a great article from the HBR. So the last one was the one I saw this Sunday morning, which was, I enjoy the show, my family does. We watch that on a regular basis. Well, in comes they did a video on what they were calling rethinking the post-pandemic workplace. Now, what was interesting was they brought in Cushman & Wakefield, who they actually converted one of their offices into what they call the 6 feet office project. And they showed what an office could look like in the near future. And in their case, they're doing currently now. It had everything from arrows on the ground pointing people in certain directions to separate and to make sure people are going in the right directions and not overlapping. Kind of like for those of you that have gone to the grocery stores and have seen the arrows, you can only enter on one side and exit on the other. Same type of thing that they had here. On the ground, which was interesting, and actually they did a nice job with it, I would say. They had 6-foot circles around desks, but it was done in I'll call it a design way that had it sort of built in to where it didn't look odd. It was a nice colors, and it didn't say like 6 feet stay away either, like danger zone, which I've seen too, which I don't kind of recommend that you do around people's desks. It just makes it weird. But this actually gave an idea where there was a space that if you came up to somebody to talk to them, there was enough distance at least. And what I liked about it, at least how they showed it, I got the impression that just the color change gave people the impression that they shouldn't necessarily enter that, which instead of having a big sign and creating this weirdness, it was actually, it worked nicely. There was the classic plastic dividers. They took quiet spaces and created those where, again, they used to have 28 people per little area in theirs. Now they had like 16, but then they converted some of those spaces and were able to create these quiet spaces, which I thought was neat. And the distancing was emphasized there as real value to drive interaction, actually. So what I thought was neat there when I thought about it was sort of the transition of thinking going from how do I keep people away by doing these things. It was more of how do I actually drive interaction with these things in place. So I just thought that the shifting of the mind of how they positioned it, of not necessarily being a negative thing, but really thinking of it from a positive way of, okay, with the requirements that we have, how can we drive more interaction? It said that the water cooler is actually more than just a cartoon representation, that is actually important, that it's really a place of social interaction, a place of communication, a place of social branding, and a workplace to do better where you could have more interactions. So I actually thought that played really, really well into more of the mindset and really showed more tactical type things instead of it just being, I don't know, a conversation about the negativity around it. It was actually a way, how do you embrace this as a positive and really capture it to think about? And it reminds me of the access care conversation that we've had, where if you take the position of not trying to figure out how to control, but you take the position of how to care and really think about the products that way, it just shifts the way that you build it, you talk about it, you communicate, you storytell. So those are the 3 stories on top of the bonus one that we gave around Openpath in the USA Today. We'll put those in the show links. We'll get those out to you. They'll be there. So we do have the questions open on the live chat. I see Todd Broderick. Good to see you, buddy. Is there? Asked a great question. The question was, after a vaccine comes out, what do you think from a technology and policy perspective will stay in place? Things like the directional walkways and things like that. So my belief, even with the vaccine, to be honest with you, I do think there's things like this that are going to stay in place just because they may come out as good practices from prevention. There are things like, I think, on the way down the road already was the open offices. People weren't liking those. So the quiet spaces that people were talking about and less density, I think that's going to stay. I don't know if the arrows on the ground are actually going to stay in that, because I don't know about you, but if you've been to the grocery store where they did have them, not everyone followed them anyways. And I don't know if they really did a good job of preventing really anything. I think that was a classic idea of a good idea, a good try, but not, I don't know if it actually impacts. Because I don't know about you, but like if you walk down those aisles one time and it's like, oh, you forgot the spaghetti sauce was down there. It's like that, like, do I walk backwards to go get it now? Like, it was just weird thing. So I don't think those will stay. I think the divider pieces, they will, but I'm not convinced people want to work in a bubble. So I don't know if that's actually going to stay that type. But I did like the distance. I think if you look at the carpet like they showed in the one, I think that's here to stay. This idea that you have your spaces, which I think is going to be great for especially people that like to work that way and have like a little bit of separation. Maybe introverts, this is like they're having their moment with some of this stuff is a good place to do it. I think visitor management, like we talked about, this pre-registration is definitely here to stay. I think these the notifications, I think that's an underrated feature set that's coming out of this, that regardless of vaccine or not, the systems and the data or what you do with it. And one thing you do with data is you've got this idea of notifications when like a space needs to be cleaned. And I do like this idea of advertising in some cases the cleanliness and just making people feel good, like this is a place that at least you know is being taken care of and it's being quantified in a way that it gives you a sense of feeling. Like, so again, like health theater, as well as the health practices like security theater, security practices, I think that matters. Like, I don't know about you, but like in places like New York City, when you go and the health has like, you know, it's A-rated, stuff like that, I think that will be interesting, and I think that's important to give that sense. I also think that matters because that's an example of care in my mind, is the way you communicate to people and the way that they show the data. And Mug Fitness is talking about it, that they've seen this with their clients, right? It's like people want that sense, and if you give them that sense, also I'm a firm believer too. That's like sometimes like when you put stuff out there, and it holds you accountable to actually have to deliver on it too, right? So like, if you're putting out that this place is as clean as it is, your chances are, if you care, which most people I believe do, you're going to do the practice of doing that. So I think those are some of the things that are going to stay. And yeah, Mandy, it's about transparency. And I think that if there's a positive thing, and Bert asked the question, what do I think a silver lining of the industry due to this pandemic is going to be? Transparency, communication, community, caring, things like that. A non-sort of transactional relationship, there still will be there, right? It's still technology. People are still buying stuff. People still need to get in and get out, do stuff like that. But I think the way that we do it will be changed, which will be really nice. And the question was, do I think that this will help in the long run? So the pandemic itself, do I think it will help? Yeah, I mean, I hate to think about a thing that is, so terrible in a lot of ways being helpful. But if we're to look at that, it has accelerated things in a lot of cases, right? So it's brought, I think in the end, it will bring some good. It's done a massive amount of devastation, and I don't want to lighten that at all. But to your question about, do I think from an industry standpoint, I think from an industry standpoint, it's going to do well for our industry from an awareness standpoint. I think it's made it more mainstream. I think it's really driven a lot of conversations around where value is at, and the systems that can do it. I think this idea that systems can sit around for 30 years and have one value proposition, really, which was just keeping people safe, is not going to last. And so I think companies are being forced. I think the ability to tell stories and communicate and really understand your value proposition on a much broader scale than just maybe the channel, 100% you have to get into that. If you're not doing that, you're totally missing the boat on this thing. So I definitely think there's some positives that will come from what is just an absolute horrific thing that I don't think any of us ever desired to be through or want to ever see again, right? So I would say that's where I would see the positive. I also think somebody brought this up. If you think about it, doing this hasn't necessarily been there before too, of these tools. We've been an industry that has been forever been very driven by, human power in the marketplace and calling on people and having a voice a lot. And I've been in a couple podcasts recently where we talked about this, where this is neutralizing a lot of things too. And you'll hear it on a podcast coming out with this marketing team that they just recently did for next week, where this idea that everyone's the same size on a Zoom link and on a Zoom video feed. And it's allowed, I think, more voices and people in the community to be able to compete with some of the larger companies that have the resources, if you would, to do things like buy the biggest booth at the trade show or have the most people out in the marketplace calling on a dealer and sort of smothering. It still is there. It's still going to be there. But I think, if anything, this has allowed an opportunity for a different conversation to be had by a different group of people. And I think collectively, the existing ones that were there before and these new ones collectively together is going to be in a better position long term. So I think that's something that is driven. So we're coming up on the 27-minute mark. I want to thank everybody. If there's no more questions, we'll call this good at this point. But again, we'll be back next Thursday for a conversation. Please sign up for the newsletter. We'll send the link and put it in here. That goes out tomorrow. It'll be this plus the links, as well as another article that we'll include there. Let's keep the conversation going. I appreciate everyone's attention and time on doing this, and everyone stay safe. So thank you very much.